So for this session, we're going to be talking about something called worker voice. The first comment that I've got on worker voice is that lots of different people will offer lots of different services, and they might actually use different terminology. So today, we're going to try and keep this very simple, so it's easy to understand what buyers, suppliers can actually do to drive their business forward. That was not me. That was them. Using techniques. So we are going to show you a video, but not just yet, thank you. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about what I see on worker voice and introducing me. And then we'll show you a little animation and then introduce you to the panel. We've got 3 organizations that will offer worker voice, and we also have a user of worker voice. So you get to see actually how this thing is actually progressing. It's been working at Sedex for a few years now. The big difference this year is people are actually starting to use it. So a little bit about myself. I'm working for one of the auditing firms, Bureau Veritas, and from my part, it's interesting that we're now starting to see worker voice being linked to social audits. My first experience of something like a worker survey was actually when I worked for an oil company, Castrol. I was just thinking, about 25 years ago, they had a poll, and it was all about worker conditions. And then after the poll, people actually worked on it. And the great thing for me, one of my dissatisfactions was that I used to cycle to work, and there were no showers. And they actually installed showers 3 months after this poll. So the idea of worker voice is there can be issues, some of them very critical, some of them serious, but it really is an opportunity for workers to get themselves put forward. At social audits, for example, the SMETA audit, quite often there are elements that we can measure, and there are some elements that are actually quite weak. I see worker voice coming in as just one of the many tools that suppliers, retailers, and sites themselves can actually use to actually fill some of these gaps. You can do a social audit to do some measurement. You can do worker voice to find out a lot about what the worker population is thinking. And there are various other consultancy and training tools that you can use. I'd like to introduce the panel. I'll introduce them very briefly, and then each one is going to say a little bit about themselves and their company, and then we'll show you a little video that talks a little bit about what can worker voice do. So we have Leah from Andwider, we have Erin from Elevate, we have Elena from Workplace Options, and we have Marie from Angus Soft Fruits, who is the user. So Leah, would you like to start off by introducing yourself and your organisation?
My 5-minute bit.
Yep.
Great. Okay. Morning. So I might be repeating my company name, at least for some who might have attended the panel yesterday, but the company's Andwider. It's called Andwider because we focus specifically on including insights about the most vulnerable workers. And that's helpful to know because the choices we make and how we work have a lot, and the tech we use have a lot to do with asking ourselves constantly, how will this affect the inclusion of the most vulnerable workers? Essentially, we call workers on their mobile phones. It's always a 5-minute call in the language of the worker's choosing. The worker never uses their voice, never mentions their name. They only ever press 1, 2, or 3 on their phones. 1 for yes, 2 for no, 3 for don't know. And that's in response to 20 questions. And at the end of the call, the worker puts the phone down, and the data is then detached from their mobile phone number forever. And that data, once all the workers have participated in a call cycle, lands on our dashboards. And those are very straightforward traffic light dashboards that show you at a glance your sites on a little map, and each site will be coded as red, amber, or green according to the last call cycle. Red means there's some critical issues, amber means a mixed picture, and green means things are looking good. But most importantly, the system measures progress, because that's why we're in this. That's why suppliers engage with workers. to both check whether things are progressing and to be able to showcase their progress. And certainly buyers and auditors are interested in whether there's been a before and after, whether the picture for workers is improving. We currently, as a company, use calls rather than other tech channels, rather than other comms channels, such as SMS or apps. And the reason being that in the particular settings we work, so we're not focused on Asia. We're active in Central and South America, in North, South, East, and West Africa, in Europe, and in Asia. But the reason why we've decided for now to use IVR or calls to mobiles, and those are voice calls, is that a lot of workers we engage with don't have smartphones, data, or Wi-Fi access. In certain geographies, that can be an assumption you make, and in certain workplaces, but we work in a lot of different workplaces. So for now, calling generates the best response rates. And it's also a decision we've made because of illiterate workers. Essentially, we find that calling allows them to participate too. And there are three passions that guide our work, and those are very apparent in the way we do things. The one is data quality, and it's not just response rates. It's also about whether workers feel safe and confident to be candid on the call. The second is the tech. It's just a third of what we do, essentially. But you need tech that's simple, clear, and seamless. And that technology and the dashboards you produce with it need to speak first and foremost to the employer, to the supplier. Why is the supplier so important to the work we do? Because they remain the driver of change in every workplace. So that's the tech. And then finally, the third thing that we're passionate about is how effectively the results are being used. I had another conversation earlier, a few minutes earlier. And it was all about the capability of the supplier and the buyer to use those results to drive material improvements. And we're quite stubborn about that one. And so we use, there are specialized materials to help suppliers and buyers develop the capacity they need to use those results to drive meaningful change for workers. But that's definitely enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. So now we have Erin coming up from a different sort of organization. They're offering, as well as worker voice, social audits, training, consultancy, and probably a lot more.
Thank you. So good morning, everybody. My name's Erin, and I work for Elevate. Like David just said, thank you. We're a service provider, and we are doing a range of advisory and work for companies, be that on consulting, be that going in doing assessment work, be that managing programs, and then analytics as well. When we specifically look at worker engagement, because we do internally and externally, rather than using the language terminology of worker voice, we talk about engagement. So we do that differently across different services. And one of the ways that we look at all this is from we're looking at from a transparency perspective. So the worker engagement that we do and the findings and the data have to be transparent with the factories, transparent with the workers, transparency for brands as well. So that's a key focus of where we are. The worker engagement that we do as well, one of the reasons when you talk to Heather, who many of you may know, who established Labelling, why they chose to go with Elevate as well, was really doing worker engagement, but putting it in the ecosystem and the context of then being able to take action on the data that you're receiving as well, to go beyond, you do your diagnostic, you utilize your tool, and we are tech agnostic, and we're engaging with workers in lots of different ways. You use that data, and then within the broader Elevate ecosystem, you can also then look at that data and make improvements, because that's what we're aiming for, is that program effectiveness, and the worker engagement is one part of that, one diagnostic tool. We are doing those worker engagement on a standalone basis. We're managing hotlines in countries like Bangladesh, in Malaysia, in the Americas, but then we're also integrating worker engagement with our SMETA assessments as well. We're doing about 100 of those a month, 1,000 that we've conducted so far, and now we're really looking at, well, we have this data, what's next? How do we make sure that we're utilizing that for real program effectiveness? And that's the conversation that we want to have. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. We now have Elena from Workplace Options. And again, another slight difference with organisation, because I'm sure she will say they have a whole raft of HR services that they will offer.
Yeah, so I'm Elena, I'm from Workplace Options. Workplace Options kind of approaches this a little bit differently than some of the other people on the stage or in this room. We've been around for almost 40 years and as an HR company. So we came into this industry working with traditional HR managers, and in the last 6 years, we've moved also to include more factories and people that are in this room and sustainability and different ways to look at it. My team is called Labor Solutions, and we focus specifically on minimum wage workers in emerging markets. And we provide a host of services that help improve HR so that we can reduce human rights risk. Now, brands can get information from our tools, but our tools are really focused on the supplier. And we want to make sure that what we do enables the supplier to perform better and make better decisions. So our kind of bread and butter tool is called Wovo. It's a technology platform, again, technology agnostic. It works on an app, but it also works via SMS and WeChat and Facebook Messenger that provides 4 basic services. So the first one is worker voice, so a way for workers to communicate anonymously with their supplier, with their factory, with their management. Then we have worker well-being tools, so on-demand e-learning tools, both professional and personal development that you can do through the app. And then we have company tools, ways for companies to communicate with their employees. So one of the things that I've heard both of them kind of say is it's really important that once you get information back from workers, that you're able to feed that back to them, and you're able to tell them what you've done to change. And so our company tools allows you to do that. And then finally, we give you analytics, and those analytics are real time. They're helping you track what messages people are sending into you at any time. And a brand can look at it and also kind of do an exam of what's going on that's positive or negative. What we've seen is that factories who have not a lot of grievances or not a lot of questions are the problem factories. The factories that have a lot of questions and grievances are the factories that have performed really well because they're listening and responding to their workers. And so this is just an interesting platform to address it, but really from an HR point of view, not from a compliance point of view.
Wonderful, thank you. So you can see 3 slightly different ways of approaching this. Now, originally we were going to have 3 users of Worker Voice today. Unfortunately, 2 couldn't come for various different reasons. So I'd like to introduce Marie to start off with from Angus Soft Fruits, and then I've got some written comments from the other 2. One thing I'd like to do with Marie is this is the first time she's actually stood up at Sedex. I think this was great for any of you out there who are thinking, this is interesting, should I do it? If you want to be a speaker at any of these, don't be frightened if your companies are quite small. Quite often the supplier base isn't actually that well heard at some of these conferences.
All right, well, hello everybody. My name's Marie. I'm new to the industry and I'm new to Angus Soft Fruits. I started back in January. My background is very much HR and I am Angus Soft Fruits HR and Ethical Manager. So Angus Soft Fruits, we are a company that's going from strength to strength. We are a grower, breeder, and packer of berries, and what we do is we enable the supply of fresh berries to our customers throughout the year. So we very much, we started off in the UK, we very much now have a global presence. And in terms of Worker Voice for me, it's very much about entering a dialogue really with workers and I suppose enabling change that's going to have a positive influence on their lives, and obviously that's going to be beneficial for the employer.
Wonderful, thank you. So we've got some topics that we'd like to talk about, and then we have some questions which can be coming in through the app. So I'm assuming that you've all been busy doing those. They'll come up on this iPad if you have questions. The first question I've got really for the Worker Voice people is, how do you measure the progress and the impact when you do your work? Leah, would you like to start?
Sure. For me, that's 2 different questions. The one, how we measure progress in a given kind of in a given rollout. Is the first one is you you measure the cooperation and buy-in of the supplier. And how you do that is how cooperative they are when it comes to uploading workers' numbers. And secondly, how long they take to log in and check on the results. So supplier buy-in. The second is the number of workers' numbers that are uploaded. That's very important, of course, because that means that determines how many workers you can engage with. The third, as mentioned, is essentially the quality of the data coming in. And there are two aspects to that. Response rates, yes, of course. Most importantly, how well response rates build between call cycles. But response rates is the first, and the second is data candor, and we've got an algorithm in our system to measure that. And then finally, most importantly, and I think this is something we really all share, is how effectively are the insights being used in that particular rollout? Is the supplier actually engaging with those results, asking questions? Is the buyer interested in and providing support and encouragement to the supplier to make the improvements needed? And then when it comes to measuring our impact, it's a pretty easy question. We count the number of workers we're engaging with, and that's also how our business works. We're paid for every worker we're engaged with. It's a per worker pricing. We also, in terms of measuring impact, measure, again, the data quality. We measure, most importantly, improvements. So average improvement of the site score. Every site gets a score from the workers. And it's what your average improvement is in terms across all the sites you're engaging in. That's another KPI in terms of the impact we're having. And of course, the average improvement in response rates. And fundamentally, it's the number of geographies we're engaging with, the number of clients we're engaging with, and the number of collectives of clients we're engaging with, because we work with a lot of ethical trading associations.
Brilliant, thank you. Erin, what do you think?
Okay, so rollout, I think we could look at that in lots of different ways. So there's the purely logistics rollout, which shouldn't be underestimated either, and the planning on every side, that's a really key part of driving success. But then perhaps more importantly is well, so what? What are you going to do when you have accessed this data, and how does it feed into your other data points so it becomes a useful exercise that's going to add value into you trying to achieve program effectiveness. That's what we're trying to work very closely with clients to deliver when we're looking at worker surveys from perhaps an integrated assessment perspective, but then you could look at rollout from a grievance mechanism, from a hotline perspective, and then you're looking at very different measures of success as well. So I think it's contextual as to what is the purpose of why you're doing that exercise, what are you doing when you have the results, and then how do you move that forward is the different ways that I would look at rollout.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think they've had great points, and there's certainly things that we look at too. The differences, or the other things that I would add to the conversation is that we're also looking at utilization rates. So how many workers are engaging with their employer? How many questions, grievances, and suggestions do we have coming in? How fast is the employer to respond to those messages? How fast are they to close the cases that they have and the problems that they have? And that doesn't mean they have to do it very quickly, but because if they do it very quickly, what we know is that they're not really answering the question, right? So we're looking for somewhere between very quickly and really long. So that's certainly an indicator of success for us. Like I said earlier, what we see is that if you don't have a lot of questions, grievances, and suggestions coming in, you probably have a problem. And then the other way that we look at it is we're looking at how employers are responding. And that's really where our account management is coming in. We're reading the messages and talking to the employers about showing empathy, explaining to workers what your plan is. How are you going to follow up with this? And then the long-term longevity of all of it. And how many people engage in the tool in general. So I think those are what we're looking at in addition to what you guys already said.
Thank you. I'm asking the same question in a slightly different way now for Marie. Have you found that you've seen improvements? And maybe you could give a couple examples if you could.
I think, again, it is about the quality of the interaction. So in terms of the levels of participation, so we have used the direct worker tool at our site in Evesham. We've done one call cycle with Leah. Participation rates weren't great, so we're hoping that when we do the next call cycle, that because we've taken on board the feedback that's come from those initial workers that did participate, we've listened, and where we've actually been able to address the issues that were raised, we are making improvements, and that will encourage more workers in the second call cycle to participate. So again, it is about participation, but it's about the quality of that interaction. So, you know, a lot of organisations will start these kind of initiatives, but actually, are they really going to pay due care and attention to the information that comes out of it? So are they effectively listening, and then are they prepared to do something with that information? And even if it's something that has been raised that perhaps the organisation is not willing to do anything practical about immediately, you know, have they given due care and consideration and fed the reason for that course of action back to the worker?
Great, thank you. Let's watch a short video, and then we'll move on to the next question.
Hello. We call many workers in different parts of the world to understand how you are treated at work. During this call, you will be asked some questions. If you complete this short call, you could win calling credit. First, we need to check which language is easiest for you. Press 1 for Bulgarian, 2 for Polish, or 3 for English. No one will ever know what answers you gave us, because when you finish this call, your answers are added to a big collection of answers. No one can tell which worker gave which answer, so it is safe to be completely honest. Would you like to answer this brief set of questions now? Please press 1 for yes, 2 for no, or 3 for call back later. Are you male or female? Press 1 for male or 2 for female. How old are you? Press 1 for under 16, 2 for 16 to 40 years old, and 3 if you are over 40. Do you work at this workplace all year round? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no, or 3 for don't know. Does your employer let you meet with other workers to talk about work and anything you want to change at work? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no, or 3 for don't know. Is anyone ever physically punished or beaten when something goes wrong at work? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no, or 3 for don't know. Is everyone working at your workplace 16 years or older? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no, or 3 for don't know. Thank you for answering these questions. We look forward to calling you again in a few months. Goodbye.
I love the music in that. This was an example of how one of the companies here can actually use worker voice. The more I hear about this, the more I understand that for worker empowerment, there are lots of different techniques people can use. I'd like to take, just to put people on the spot a bit here, one of the questions that's come from the floor, which is quite relevant now. Oh, we've had more, I've got to find it again. Let's read it out. One of my queries is whether the most vulnerable workers would actually have access to a mobile phone to be reached in this way. So before I give this to the panel, I've got a bit of experience from this point. The first time I saw Worker Voice, a company went to Bangladesh, and they were really finding out, is it safe to work in this building? And they realized that some of the workers then, and this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, they wouldn't have mobile phones. So what they did is they took some little clickers like this one, and they got a whole lot of people in a room, and they had, everyone could say A, B, C, or D with the clicker after they'd watched a video. So it was a great way of not just getting the worker voice, but actually finding out if people understood some of the policies that the site was doing. But I'd like to ask the same question now to the group.
Brilliant.
We've got one here as well. Who wants to start?
I'd love to. We don't assume that all workers have mobile phones, and we don't assume that, forced laborers or children or everyone is going to be answering the calls. So we use what's called distributive questioning. And we turn every worker who answers the calls into a witness. So the questions are always, have you or everyone working with you, or have you or anyone working with you ever experienced the following? Which means essentially that you have a distributive eye view or a distributive lens on working conditions and worker well-being in that site. And that each worker who does participate is not just reporting about themselves, but reporting about what they've observed across the workforce.
I think something that we talked about as a group before when we were brainstorming about the session was that every factory is different, and every factory has a different set of conditions. And the most important thing that you need to know is that you need to be flexible for that and pick a provider who also is flexible for that. And so, there are some situations in which we go on site and we may be doing something more proactive on site. And there may be situations in which, workers never see us and they only interact with us through their mobile phone. But that no facility is the same, and you've got to be ready for the unexpected. And so I think that that's a really important thing to be comfortable with and to move forward in the process of this. And also to know that technology is not a silver bullet. This isn't gonna change and make everything wonderful overnight, right? That there's still work to be done, and that there's lots of other solutions out there as well to work towards this.
Yeah, I would say this is where the context piece comes in, to design the right worker engagement for the context of the workforce that you're trying to engage. And that's where assumptions are dangerous as well, because maybe even if we have workers who do have access, maybe then they're told during a certain period, right, you can't bring your phone to work during this time. Or so we're constantly challenging assumptions and learning. We are experimenting, we are continually learning to make sure that every time we design something new or we're looking to address a different type of vulnerable worker, that we're contextualizing this to get the right information. An example of that we're doing at the moment is trying to access a workforce who aren't site-based. So we have to make sure we're designing something that works in their context and we can access them and we can protect data privacy. There are so many contextual pieces that we have to consider when we're addressing different types of worker, different countries, different ways that workers can access information. It goes on.
I'd actually like to add something. Another thing that we were also discussing before this is that oftentimes people try to look at this kind of tool or other tools and go, I just want to focus on child labor, or I just want to focus on forced labor. Is Worker Voice going to help me do that? Well, the long answer, the short answer is yes, eventually, right? But the long answer is if we're not talking to workers and engaging them on everyday issues like how dirty the toilet is, or what the song choice is that's on that day, we're never going to get to these vulnerable workers because they're never going to feel like they're comfortable. Because if I'm not comfortable telling my employer or a third party that the toilet is dirty and that never gets fixed, I'm never going to tell you about child labor. I'm never going to step forward about forced labor. So sometimes we need to kind of back up and look at these small wins that we'll have along the way. And I think that inherent in this question is how do we get to the very vulnerable workers? Well, there's also a lot of people before there. And to get there, we really need to build trust and have conversations over a long term about some things that you may think are trivial, but are not trivial for their lives at all.
Absolutely, and I think, the use of mobile technology is just one tool. As an employer, we have lots of different ways and initiatives that are available to us, and as we've already mentioned, it is very much about particular context. And again, as you say, it's very much about the quality. You need to start a conversation somewhere, and it should really be a two-way conversation. Again, as I said before, it's about using listening, effective listening.
Okay, great. Now, we did have two other panellists who unfortunately couldn't join us, but we do have some written comments from them that we'd love to share. The first one is Sam, who's working with Concordia. So this I'm hoping David Camp is looking up. David's from the Association of Labour Providers. So I'm really hoping that as Worker Voice becomes more popular, from a labour provider point of view, David will actually be doing, I'm hoping, a lot of work in this area as well. But Sam is saying, direct worker recording can help you gather data. It's sourced directly from workers, so it's not diluted, and it creates a better future for those working. Now, quite often with a labour provider, like with Concordia, they're providing workers. In Concordia's example, this is to farms. So their employees are actually working in different locations. So they're coming at this, making sure that their workers are having a good protection at the sites they're putting them into. They like to communicate with their customers with a thorough process. Effort is needed by the farmers that are being involved. There's also a lot of information that's flowing both ways. The farms can actually have some training on this, and so can the workers before the worker voice happens, and then the summaries have to go back as well. And what they found was in the first cycle, they managed all of this, but then in the second cycle, they will actually be working with the labour provider. So Leah, do you want to have a few comments on that particularly?
Sure. So Concordia, in the first year that we worked together, elected to do the supplier engagement themselves, to engage with their growers because they have an existing relationship, and to prepare those growers for the call cycles. And now that we're scaling up and working for a second year with them, Sam said, you know, that was more labor intensive than I'd thought. In the very first year, we'd said, you sure you want to do that? That's what our support team's about. And he said, no, I've got the existing relationship, let me have a go. And in the second year, we'll certainly be doing that for him. I think that's a very important point, is that getting the suppliers on board takes a bit of doing. Suppliers are a bit scared sometimes. And essentially, that's why you need a support team or a model that engages quite thoroughly with the supplier for you in order to make sure they're on board and they upload workers' numbers and get the point of the exercise.
Elena, do you want to talk a bit about maybe the dashboard that you use and
Yeah, well, I want to tack on to this really quickly to say that one of the things that we see is if a brand or a client, somebody who's asking their suppliers to do something, if you're not clear about your expectations, suppliers won't use it. They don't know where the data is going. They don't know what to do. Like they're scared. Like they're scared of the transparency. So I think the most important thing, if I'm speaking to brands right now, for you guys to sit out and say is, what is my expectation? What do I want to gain from this? What is my goal? And that helps so much with factories, buying into it and wanting to be part of it. Another thing that I thought was really interesting about his comment is he talked about the unfiltered, so getting information directly from the workers. And I think we have to remember that the incentive structures within a facility or a farm or anything of that nature are quite different. So you have a line manager who at the end of every day is supposed to hit a target. And you have an HR manager who at the end of every month is supposed to have a low turnover rate. These are not the same goals. So if I'm a line manager and somebody comes to me and says, I'm sick today, and you look at your number and you're like, oh, I'm not going to make my number, then no, you can't go home. But if an HR manager was to have that same question, the HR manager would say, of course you can go home. Why? Because that worker now goes back to the line and gets 3 more people sick. And those 3 people don't come into work the next day. And so HR has a bigger issue. So there's a little bit about how do we get the worker to have conversations with HR directly to bridge those gaps, because there's a lot of filtering that's happening. We all have our own agendas. We all played the game when we were kids where you whisper in somebody's ear and it comes around. We didn't have agendas when we were playing that. But I'll tell you what, managers have agendas. So how do we get through some of that, right? And have more engaged conversations. That wasn't an answer to your question. I was just kind of playing off of what he was saying.
Well, I'll do the same back. Erin, would you like to take this opportunity maybe to... Thank you so much. Can you share the organisation you're with? Right, great. We've got that. That's noted. If anybody else has any burning questions, if you can put them on the app, because they're coming up here, and we're going to focus on questions that have the most likes.
I have a question, but it is partly preceded by a small statement. Can I do that?
Can we wait to the end? Have you not got the app?
On the app, a bit too long.
Okay, we'll come back, don't worry. Before we do, Erin, maybe you'd like to take this opportunity just to talk about maybe how you integrate worker voice with other
maybe
things.
that answers David's question as well in a way, because I know that we've...
Yep.
So utilising the tool, integrating that with the SMETA audit, absolutely that's what we're working to achieve. And I know that we've been managing pilots using the Sedex tool, using the Elevate tool. Again, it's contextual. What are you looking to achieve from the activity? What is the information that you want to achieve from that particular worker engagement? Is it the Sedex tool? Is it another? We design different surveys for different types of interactions where clients are looking to achieve a certain insight, a certain analytics that they want and the data that they're looking to get there. And that ties into very much a point that I wanted to make that related to the previous question as well, in terms of the purpose of this has to be to deliver benefits for business. So there has to be a benefit for the supplier. There has to be, we're seeking this data so that we can give you recommendations for where you may have productivity issues, where you have turnover rates, where you can actually, you can have an intervention that will reduce your turnover, that will increase your productivity, so you can demonstrate why you did the worker engagement in the first place. There has to be, yes, absolutely a benefit to workers, but there has to be a benefit for the employer, and they have to own that for this to really work as well. So hopefully that answered your question as well as the purpose to this.
Did that help?
I think maybe what he would like us to say is to describe the tool a little bit, like what has Sedex released. Is that? So Sedex has a survey that lots of different providers are able and willing to deliver for you. They've come up with questions. Right now, they don't offer comparable data to those questions yet, but I think as it goes on and they get more and more data sets, they'll be able to offer you comparable data so you can see where you rank in comparison to other Sedex members. Ultimately, what that takes to get that comparable data set, and probably this is one of the plugs you need, is more people to use it, right? So the more results that we have, the more anonymity can be involved in it, and it's simply a survey. But surveys can be delivered in lots of different ways. The Sedex tool does not prescribe how it's delivered, so it could be via IVR on the phone, or it could be a link through SMS, or it could be on-site. What's going to work for your facility? That's the Sedex tool. More people use it, the more data we have, the more comparable it is, the better it is for everyone.
Let me quick one.
Just 2 sentences in reply to David's point. The big value add of the worker well-being assessment tool is that it's about worker well-being. And what's meant by tool there is essentially a set of indicators or questions, kind of the themes covered when you gather data direct from workers. There's not always a huge demand for worker well-being kind of tools and surveys on their own. So what we do, and I think a lot of the providers are doing that, is injecting worker well-being assessment tool questions in everything we do. So that, frankly, morally, we have an obligation as providers never to neglect worker well-being, because it's not just about whether you locked up and prevented from leaving your workplace. It's about, what's your mental health like? How motivated are you, et cetera, et cetera. Are you communicated with in a respectful manner, et cetera. So that's, I think, is a big value add from the worker well-being assessment tool.
Right, thank you. The next question is coming from the app, which has lots of likes. It's also something that one of the other panelists who couldn't make it has actually given us an answer for, which is great. Plus, it's something that I can comment on because it's relevant to social audits. Is there an issue with workers being told how to respond or feeling they need to respond in a certain way in order to ensure that the company does not lose business? We see coaching at workers who are being employed by the site at social audits. It's a big, big challenge. At a social audit, we try and break the ice by getting to know them. From Michelle at Mr. Price in South Africa, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, she is saying, well, with worker voice, you can actually talk to them in their local language better than you can sometimes at social audits. And you can reach more workers than you can at social audits. And that can actually help you get more candor. Elena, would you like to start answering this one?
Yeah, I'm actually going to give an Elevate answer because I heard Ian say this a few months ago, which is that they haven't figured it out yet, right? That of course surveys are eventually going to be hacked, right? Eventually we're going to see workers be coached on some of these things. They haven't figured it out yet with surveys. And I think that from our point of view, that's why surveys aren't really the end-all be-all, right? When we talk about worker voice, we're talking about more than just surveys. And so it's partly about engaging the supplier so they see the value. When a supplier sees the value in the data that you're giving them, then they don't coach workers because they want that data back. So it's about empowering the supplier to feel like, hey, if they get bad results, that doesn't mean that you're going to leave them. That means that you're going to work with them and engage with them and talk to them about other things, but it doesn't mean that it's the end of your relationship. And I think that's a mind shift change, right? That for a long time in some audits, if you were low or you got a bad score, that meant that we were out and we were washing our hands of it. And this is a little bit about changing that relationship and saying, we're going to be collaborative. We want you to be a better manager. We want you to be a better employer. And so we're going to help you do that. And so I think that it is about changing the conversation a little bit and also about empowering them to own it.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think we are figuring it out because what we do, and it's the same when we're doing a social audit where we suspect and we can use our data analytics tool to see where we suspect coaching, and then we can take that data out of the analytics. So if you've got a whole series of responses that are all the same over a certain period, then we can use that. We have systems, we have that on the back end to address where we think that data is a result of coaching so that we are ahead, one step ahead, but with everything. Sometimes you're working off your back foot, but we're playing off the front foot to try and get ahead of this and then to take that data out so that we're, again, as we do with the assessment data, we're playing and we're doing our what needs to happen next off the information that we call the clean, transparent data. Yeah.
You're dying to come in, Leah.
No, I love the coaching question. I think we should always assume that coaching takes place because of that slight anxiety that employers have about what their employees will say when on an anonymous channel. And it's not just an assumption that the employer is doing the coaching. Sometimes it's just one frustrated worker or other parties in the landscape. And so how do you deal with that? Essentially, all of us should be dealing with it every step of the way. Yes, in the way we prepare the supplier or employer for what's to come, but also in the call experience itself. Memory retention is such that any human being can on average, remember 3 questions verbatim. So the first 3 questions in our calls are always demographic questions, always male, female, age, and permanent or seasonal. And then thereafter, the questions are muddled. And every worker gets a different call experience, but also, response habits. It's not easy, it shouldn't be easy on any of the systems to just push yes, 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 and think you've delivered a perfectly positive picture, and no, and delivered a negative picture. We should be configuring it to combat coaching throughout. So in our own work, a yes is not always positive and a no is not always negative. And then again, it's very obvious on a dashboard. Coaching, when you see kind of an amber picture, we use traffic light rating, so when you see all ambers, all high amber, or all high reds, or all high greens, an algorithm should be spotting that, or a team should be spotting that, and essentially that particular site should be classified differently. We call it a low confidence site when that happens. Do we then get onto the call to the supplier and say, we know what you've been doing? No, because it may not be the supplier. What we do is we say, congratulations, you've generated a set of results, and you keep moving to the second call cycle, because as anxieties drop, so pressure on that workforce to say particular things also dissipates, and you get more and more candor in the system.
Could I just say from a user perspective, in terms of coaching, that's really going to impact on the integrity of the data. And actually, in terms of worker voice, it's not it's not an exam, it's not right or wrong, there's not a pass or fail rate. So for us, it was very much about, this is part of our journey, our continuous improvement. So we want to see where we are now, and then, so many weeks, months down the line, we want to measure that progress that we're making. So if you are going to coach, then really, what is the point?
So, another question while you're on the topic.
Yes.
What I would love to know, you've used one labour worker voice provider. What are your tips in choosing an organisation to work with? What challenges have you had? What lessons have you learned?
I think very much it's about understanding, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, what you're letting yourself in for. Someone once said to me years ago, failing to plan is planning to fail. So you need to be prepared to put a lot of planning and effort into this. Communication with all of these things is key. So in terms of the messages that are communicated to managers, line leaders, supervisors, in terms of messages that are communicated to the workers. So in terms of enabling that safe environment, encouraging participation, trying to mitigate against or remove any fear that workers might have. Certainly, when we rolled this out earlier on this year, there was a very, very short time frame in which we had to prepare for it, which I inevitably thought would impact on participation levels, because there wasn't a great deal of time to ensure that we were all coming from a level playing field, that we were, on the same page. So the understanding of why are you doing this? What is it all about? And actually in terms of what's in it for the worker, because in terms of the preparation of the calling times, we were asked to consider 3 times of day in which we would like the calls to be made. And obviously from an operational point of view, you want them to happen when they're going to have least impact on operations. But in terms of then, where is the worker in terms of that time of day and how are they feeling? But again, in terms of maintaining or achieving those participation levels. So, we suggested that one of the call times was later on in the evening. Well, actually, when we look again at call cycle 2, that time really isn't the best for workers, because they might be putting the kids to bed, whereby maybe, I don't know, some of them might have second jobs, or they might be taxiing children about or whatever. So that obviously is going to impact on your participation levels.
Great, thank you. So I've got one question for the panel, and then we'll take the question from the floor, because we've got 4.5 minutes left. Can each of you just spend maybe 20, 30 seconds talking about one thing that's been brought up with worker voice that's actually led to a really significant improvement? So,
Yep. Do you want me to?
Shall I go as a user?
Yeah, why not?
So one of the things that came up was access to drinking water with one of our suppliers. And as that was a direct issue that was raised through doing this. And so our supplier addressed that pretty promptly by making bottled fresh water available to their workers.
We see everything, right? We see such a wide variety of things. But one of the examples we use a lot is we had a factory who had an abusive transportation, like they had a new bus driver and they were abusing the workers on the bus, and the way they were able to see is they can see the cadence when messages come in and what they're about, and they saw a huge spike. And so they figured out what was going on, they were able to investigate it, and they were able to replace that provider within a day. So that was a big change that happened there.
I would talk about the example of where we've done the diagnosis, we've spotted the issue, which is maybe productivity related and turnover. We've gone in, we've worked with the facility, and then you're talking about the change created from the worker engagement. So you're talking about a 6% increase in productivity and between 3 and 5 decrease in turnover. So then you're getting to the so what of doing the worker engagement. You take that information, you do your diagnostic, you deliver a solution, then you can look at what change you can create.
Wow, that's powerful, isn't it?
I think there's a really good point that she's making in that, which is that worker surveys themselves don't make change.
Yeah.
It is the action that you take thereafter that makes changes. So that's a really important piece of it.
The same as social audits. They are measuring.
Completely. So my example, I'm going to steal kind of a little bit of two different sites. So one, typically health and safety indicators do improve. When they're flagged as red, they're the simpler fixes. So, you know, to give you a recent example, protective gear was loud and clear, the only red on this particular site, and lo and behold, 10 weeks later, it had disappeared as a red, simply because it was easy to then buy the protective gear in between. But what I find interesting is that sometimes there are scary results. There are really tricky bits, like underage workers. And then what's happened when we've worked with an audit, actually, Angus worked in two different settings, one in Morocco and one in Evesham in the UK, and this is not related to Angus. But we often work, this is just a segue to say we often work with auditors. And in this one particular case, as it was in Scotland, there was an allegation by some of the workers that there were underage workers on site. The auditor then used that information to check what was going on and to check what documentation was in place. And indeed, the actual growers started to double check the seasonal workers coming in and their age and documentation to prove it. And it was resolved by the auditor in part.
So this to me is the most interesting thing. As an auditor, we can hope to get some information coming in from Worker Voice, and then we can put data back into Worker Voice to really help improve issues. I'm aware we've only got a minute left. Could you ask your question in about 20 seconds?
20 seconds. We use apply the KISS rule, keep it short and simple. So just like airport toilets have or immigration have, we put up an iPad which says happy or not software with 4 levels. And we do get a fair amount of idea of what is the goings on with the workers. But 2% of the workers, I think, which is a human nature, do say they are unhappy. Some people are unhappy to be working itself. But we never share that data because we do apprehend an auditor might turn into a bloodhound with that 2% people who are unhappy, with 98% are happy or okay.
Okay, thank you. And I think the issue with this is as well asking the right questions and setting this up so that it's not just a series of very quick questions. And my quick answer to this, because we are running out of time, it is engage with one of the professionals in this industry who can actually help not just with 1 or 2 transactional questions, but to put a proper program in place. Do you want to jump in?
I think you're right, but to answer your question, because we get asked this all the time, perfect is not perfect, right? So if you had 100% of your people who came back and said they were happy, your data would be incorrect, because that's not possible. And so the fact that you're showing something that isn't going well, that there is a little bit, I think that's a great and positive thing to share with other people. So I talk to suppliers all the time who are like, I want 100%, I want this all to be perfect. That's not what's gonna happen, and I think you just need to be comfortable with that. I think these are great results if these are what they are, but I think David is right. There should be other questions that are asked to get deeper into it.
Yeah. Yeah. So time is up. Are we allowed an extra question? Can we have one more question? So the one that's most interesting to me and has the most likes that we haven't gone through, how do you get useful data from multilingual workers that do not have access to companies' internal systems and might have lots of temporary workers?
Yeah.
So temporary workers, they're here today, they might not be here tomorrow.
Yeah. And I think that's they're the kind of interesting projects that we're experimenting with at the moment in terms of, well, how do we access those workers? How do we build trust that they respond? How do we make sure we have the contextual systems that make sure all of those people can respond? And I think Malaysia is a great example of where we're working there across multiple languages, multiple ways people need to engage. They're temporary, maybe they're migrant. Where do you engage with them? Before, during? Do you survey that community to build that analytical picture? Are you really trying to get a real deeper understanding of where the conditions for their ultimate employer. Again, it's that contextual building the project to answer the question that you ultimately need that information on. And I think a key part of it as well, and a piece of research I'd like to flag, is the West Principles have just released a new report earlier this month around what is the best practice after we've been doing this for so many years, and they give 7 key things that you need to have in place to have a successful worker engagement project. And
I'm glad we got that last point in. I think worker voice is now starting to become mainstream. So if anybody is interested in worker voice, please speak to your audit body or one of the service providers directly. So thank you, everybody from the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.